Welcome to Life After Loss for Grief Line. Pat Panetta here, Louisa Smith in the studio, and so is Yvonne Madden, the author of Life After. And joining us is Sally Douglas and Imogen Khan from the very highly popular Good Mourning podcast. Hi there, girls.
Hi.
Can I call you the Hamish and Andy of the grief community?
Absolutely. We'll take it.
What a compliment. Yes, you absolutely can.
Yeah, because there's a great energy between you two girls, the podcasts. I mean, you've really found something special there in what you're presenting on your podcast and on your social media platforms. Congratulations.
Thank you. Thank you.
Now, Louisa, I know you're a big fan too of the Good Mourning podcast. So maybe we should learn a bit about the girls beforehand, that you both, the girls on the line, both lost their mums while they were in their 30s, and this inspired this Good Mourning podcast.
Yeah, I mean, look, I could probably leave it to them to go into a bit more detail about the why. But in terms of why Grief Line love Good Mourning is because they are really brave and courageous to encourage conversations around grief and just shine the light on all different types of losses. While they have lost loved ones in their life, their conversation is about all kinds of losses and how we as a society behave when it comes to having conversations around our grief experiences. And it's also because it is such a heavy topic, and coming into this space 12 months ago for myself, there just wasn't enough content that was contemporary and I guess confident as well, and it had a personality until I found these girls. And then I realised, you can have a personality around the content that you're trying to deliver when it comes to the grief narrative.
That's a great compliment for you girls. Do you feel that you're contemporary and you're talking about this topic with a sort of an easy sort of gloss across it all to make it more consumable for people?
Yes, you could definitely say that. I had a bit of a joke with Sal the other day that it's almost like we've given death a rebrand, haven't we, Sal, where it's just a bit more approachable and relatable, and there's colour, our content is colourful, and we found a lot of the content relating to grief and loss out there was quite dark and heavy. So, yeah, we like to think that it's sort of a more approachable kind of space for people now.
And for us, grief doesn't have to be all doom and gloom. We approach it with honesty, but really importantly, a little bit of humour. And that's what our audience love, because, humour does really get you through the dark times. And just because we're talking about grief doesn't mean we can't be funny along the way.
Absolutely. So I guess I've got a million questions, but first of all, I think it's really important for the context of our viewers and our listeners to tell us a little bit about your own grief experiences and particularly the loss, both of you, of your mums.
So I am Im, and my mum died by suicide in February of 2020, and it still feels like a shock for me to even say that nearly 2 years down the line. It was a complete shock, and it threw me straight into grief, which was something that I had no idea going into how to deal with it, how to cope. I felt incredibly lonely. I felt like no one truly understood what I was going through. And I think, sometimes I could be in a room full of people and I just still felt really alone. I had a 9-month-old baby at the time. So I was trying to navigate even just early motherhood on top of grief, which felt really compounding. It was a really, really difficult time. And I felt like I needed some extra support, and I found a support group for Motherless Daughters. And that is where I met Sal. And it's a bit of a love story, isn't it, Sal?
It is. It really is.
So do you feel like your mums, and you mentioned this in the podcast, have brought you two girls together and Yvonne Madden's in the studio as well, girls, the author of Life After, I'm sure you agree, through this terrible experience, something different and good has resulted after your grief, Sally and Imogen?
Absolutely. We say it all the time. We feel like our mums have worked their magic wherever they are. There's just so many synchronicities and so many moments which we just there's just no other explanation for it. And yeah, we feel incredibly lucky to have met. Like it's a 1 in a million type friendship. And we were almost like living parallel lives up until the point of the loss of our mums, which is a whole nother story on its own. But we definitely do believe that they have played a hand in our meeting, because it's been so helpful having someone that gets it. And very lucky.
Now, we heard your story, Imogen. I'm sorry, Sally. So you lost your mum also and you were aged in your 30s?
Yes. So I was 33 when my mum passed away. Like Im, it was completely unexpected. So my mum died suddenly in November 2019. She had epilepsy and she'd forgotten to take her medication the day before. And with epilepsy, it's very finite and it can bring on a seizure. And she died from something they call SUDEP, which is sudden and unexpected death in epilepsy. And it was a complete shock. Like Im, I woke up one morning and the news was delivered that my mum had passed away. And all of a sudden I found myself in this tumultuous world of grief. And it was incredibly lonely. And I had never, ever given it a thought before about what grief was or what I would do when my loved ones passed away. And then all of a sudden, until it's happened to you, you just think it's for other people. Okay. And you don't really think about how you would handle it when it happens to you. And I know this is what you're trying to cover with this series, but there is a real stigma around talking about grief. And I think it's only when you're in it that you realize that. So it was incredibly lonely. And despite having a really strong network, I felt quite isolated in my experience, because not a lot of my peers had lost somebody in their 30s. They hadn't gone through a significant loss. And it was difficult to really truly talk about what I was going through until I met Imogen, who understood.
Yvonne, I can see you nodding there when you hear that. So you can relate to this feeling of loneliness and this sudden loss where all of a sudden, the black cloud sort of covers your thoughts and life?
Yeah, well, I guess like Sally and Imogen, I hadn't had a loss before either, and I really didn't know what had hit me. But also with that idea of shock, I mean, I had 15 odd months to perhaps think about what was coming, but even then I was still so shocked.
Because Paul had cancer.
Paul had cancer.
Passed away. Yep.
Yeah, so obviously we knew it was not good at all, but the doctors kind of leave you with some hope, so you grab onto that, ignore the bad things that they're saying and cling on to the few positives that they might say. And so I can't imagine the shock that you felt, because I was shocked even with a lot of warning.
And I'm really interested in the age group that you're all in when you experienced your losses, because it's normal for us to think, loss, grief, death, it only happens to people later in life. And then, we quickly are reminded that it happens at every age. But do you think there was a gap in support for younger people that had lost someone close to them, especially a parent or a partner? Was there a sort of an ageism aspect to it?
I found, and I know it's the same for Im, that there was the grief support in Australia tended to be for parents who have lost a child or older spouses who had lost a spouse. And it felt to us like there was quite a sort of no man's land in between that. I don't know if your experience was the same, Yvonne.
I overall, I agree, but I did find one group, it was called Younger Bereaved Partners, I think it was called. So it was targeted at me. I think you had to be under 40, I think, to qualify for this group. Yes. But apart from that, I agree with you, but I was very lucky to find that there's one group in Melbourne that does that.
We found Motherless Daughters Australia, and that's how we met. So there were certainly a few, but in terms of having lots of options or there being lots of, conversations happening, we definitely found it to be quite barren.
Mm-hmm. So I want to go back to the stigma. So there's the stigma just generally around grief discussions, and it's kind of like, you're going to take me into a dark place and I don't want to go there, so let's not talk about it. So there's that side of things. But then there's also the stigma around the type of death. So, we're uncomfortable about talking about suicidality here in Australia as well. So How was your loss received by your community and the people around you because of the circumstances of your mother's death?
People really don't know what to say at the best of times, and then throw in a very sudden and traumatic loss. It's very uncomfortable for people. And I did find that, and I was always very open and honest. Obviously, I started a podcast and I've been sharing my story along the way, but it does make people really uncomfortable, and that can be really difficult for the person who's grieving, because you want to talk about your loss and you want to talk about your loved one, but it almost just becomes this big elephant in the room that people just don't want to approach because they don't know what to say. They don't want to say the wrong thing. So yeah, it can be really difficult for people.
So for people listening today, what advice could you offer them if they have someone they care about who's lost someone beloved in their life to suicide?
The first and foremost thing that I would suggest for people is just be really mindful of the language that you use around this type of loss. And it's something that I wasn't aware of until it happened to me, but a lot of people still use the term committed suicide. And that can be really hard to hear when you have lost someone that way, because it almost feels like they have committed a crime or they've done something wrong. And it's not that at all. And I don't think we treat suicide the same way that we would treat other losses, such as if a loved one died by cancer or natural causes. And I think overall we really need to start to, treat suicide in the same way and with the same softness and the same language and the same respect that you would any other type of loss. And I think as well, when you are dealing with suicide loss, it is such a complicated process. So it's really helpful to have people just be really patient with you and, always be there to listen to what you have to say without trying to fix the situation. And I know for me, I needed to talk it through. There's so many unanswered questions going around and around. Like, I found it really helpful to process what had happened by talking. So yeah, just hold that space for people to do that, because it is a very, very complicated and traumatic loss.
Yvonne, earlier in a discussion when we were talking about your book Life After, just to what Sally was mentioning, Imogen was talking about there, you said that you sort of look for a why, but there was no real answer or a why. And I guess, Sally, you spoke about finding the why as well. It's very complicated. Is it healthy to try to find a why, or do you just get tangled up in your own sort of thoughts?
I think it's pretty natural to be looking for that why. But Imogen, just when you've been explaining what's happened with your mum, it reminded me of a woman I interviewed for the book who ultimately decided that it wasn't right for her to be in the book, and the reason she decided against it is because of exactly what you're talking about. So this lady lost her son to suicide, and she lived in a small town, and she faced things like, long-time friends coming up to her and saying, "You must be so ashamed of your son and what he did." Awful, awful things on top of everything that she was dealing with. And I think people walking across the road didn't know what to say to her, and she's grew up in this town. She knows everyone. There was some shame and stigma, and it was really hard to hear that she had to go through that.
I've heard that too. People sort of get upset and angry with the person who's done it, as if they've made a choice, it was their fault. That's really just not the way to think, is it?
This family's grief.
Yeah, they look at it as a really selfish act. And that's something that I talk about in my episode of our podcast, where I share my story, which I kind of break that down. And once you look at it, like, I don't actually see suicide as a selfish act at all. Like, imagine getting yourself to that place where you're so hopeless that you see no other way out, and oftentimes I think people that do take their own life don't want to burden other people with, their situations or their circumstances. So it is really quite the opposite. So yeah, it can be really hard, and it can bring up a lot of feelings of shame and guilt and all sorts of complicated emotions for the bereaved. So yeah, like you said, Yvonne, like it can be really difficult when the community are viewing it in that way.
Was it you, Im, or was it Sally who read the final sort of WhatsApp or the text message you got from your mum the evening before she passed away? Was that you, Sally, on that podcast that Im was talking about when you spoke about your own story?
It was me, yes. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So that's, just referring to what Imogen was saying, the sudden sort of death of her mum. The same happened with you, and that text message you read out during that podcast really sort of was a way of sharing what happened to you. It was a very special moment.
It was. So my mum sent me a message the night before she passed away, and it just said she was sharing an article that she'd read about a hairdresser who helps the homeless and cuts their hair for free. And I was a hairdresser in a former life. And she basically said, this is my fantasy for you, with your kind heart, helping others in the way that this hairdresser does. Forgive me, I'm being self-indulgent. All my love, Mum. And that was the last thing that I ever heard from her, because she passed away the next morning and we didn't get to talk between then. So it just feels very poignant that I feel like I'm living and doing through Good Mourning what her last wishes were for me. So yeah, it's a really powerful message, and I always look back at it and it evokes a lot of emotion.
Do you find that with Griefline, Louisa, things like text messages and Facebook pages and things, people pass away, what's the best thing to do is to keep them and reflect back, and you can hang on to the memory of the person you loved?
Yeah, absolutely. So there's it's called continuing bonds, and what it is that you're always maintaining some connection with that person that you've lost, and it is a really healing, comforting thing to do. And we do encourage people who phone into the helpline or attend our support groups to practice that, which is, keeping the text messages or wearing a jumper or a shirt, that belong to that loved one. There's so many different things that you could do, cooking their favourite meals on Christmas Day and going to see their favourite films, when they're playing at the theatre. And that's all about maintaining the bond with that individual.
Sally and Imogen, you spoke to somebody who spoke about life or consciousness which continues on after somebody passes, and to Lou's point, when you're looking at things when they're alive, are you connecting with their energy on the other side? I know it's a bit, but that's something you explored in your podcast, Sally and Imogen.
Yes, we interviewed Leslie Kane, who wrote Surviving Death, which was the documentary, the book behind the documentary on Netflix called Surviving Death. And it was such a fascinating conversation. But we also love that continuing bonds theory too, because I think people used to think that it was healthy to kind of let go of your loved one and move on and not think about them. And that was how you deal with grief. But really, the opposite way is so much more healing, when keeping that connection with them and just, continuing to have that relationship with them. And when we spoke to Leslie, she talked about consciousness living on after we die, which we found so fascinating, and also how connecting with them in spirit can be really helpful. And Sal and I absolutely love signs, like connecting with our mums, looking out for signs, don't we, Sal?
We do. Big fans.
That was one of my favourites as well. Sally, you're from Coventry, aren't you, in the UK?
I am, yes.
It's on your research.
We're broadcasting from a studio in Coventry Street, South Melbourne, Sal. There's a sign.
I did see that. I said to Im, it's Coventry Street, it's a sign.
There you are.
No, but she also said 1111, which is like Sally's spiritual sign symbol from her mum too.
That's the number of where we're at. There you are.
That's brilliant.
Signs? Did you get any signs from Paul? Do you see things and you think, that's him talking to me?
I probably think a little bit differently about that, but I can really relate to just the keeping of things and all the decisions that you make about whether to clean out the wardrobe, and that's actually things like that, the practical things like that. It's a topic that came up quite a bit in the book as well. There's one story that really struck me. Robert Gropel, he lost his wife Marissa while they were climbing Mount Everest together, Robert's a really smart guy. He's a vet. He's climbed the highest mountains around the world, and he talks about how he couldn't throw out his wife's conditioner bottle. It was just sitting there all crusty and dusty.
Mm-hmm.
He couldn't part with it. It took him a year or two. So that kind of thing interests me, just the day-to-day kind of decisions that you make as part of this process.
Mm.
Louisa, we've got a few minutes left. Is something you want to mention to the girls before we go, or something we should say?
I want like another half an hour.
Yeah,
I know. I did want to touch on, when I remember when you were saying earlier, Yvonne, you lost your husband in 2015, and there's this perception, and you don't know if you've actually heard it or if it's just a feeling, that people expect that there's a timeline to how long you're allowed to feel sad. And Sal's got this expression, and Imogen uses it as well, about having griefy days, and it's okay to feel griefy. And, throughout your whole experience, the rest of your life, is it right to say that you're going to have those days and that don't listen to anyone else, just have your griefy day?
Yeah.
Yeah, and I think people don't realise that even if it's years down the line, you still have griefy days, and we call them grief sessions, where we actively try and draw our grief out. If we feel the emotion under the surface, we get the memory box out, we look at the photos, we listen to the music, and we try and sit in the feelings. And I think people don't understand that it's still with you, and you're still going to feel griefy some days. You might have months where you feel strong, and Yvonne, I'm sure it's the same for you. You might have a strong week, and then out of nowhere, it pops up. And I think that's really important for people to know, that it can come at any time, no matter how far along you are.
Yeah. And like you said, there's no real timeline for it. Like, there are a lot of misconceptions about grief, but one of the biggest ones is, I think, people who haven't gone through loss themselves perceive grief to be something temporary, like a task that you can complete and then move on with your life and go back to normal, when it's not that at all. Like, we've come to learn that grief is a lifelong process, and I think it will evolve and it will change over time. But the whole thing about acceptance is, I think, like, acceptance is accepting that grief becomes a part of you. And you learn to carry it and you learn to manage it over time. And that's, one of the biggest misconceptions is it's not going anywhere.
Yeah. And there's the Lois Tonkin's theory of growing around your grief is the one that resonates the most with us. Over time, you learn to grow around it. It doesn't go away. It might get a little bit smaller in terms of the magnitude of the feeling, but it is with you, and the loss is part of your life, and you carry them in your hearts and your mind. And it's just learning to live your life with loss, really.
Sally Douglas, Imogen Khan from the Good Mourning podcast, thank you for your time. Now, we can find your podcast on all the normal platforms and also your social media platforms as well, girls.
Yes, we are on Instagram. We are at Good Mourning Podcast, and morning is spelt with a U. And yes, we're on all the major podcast platforms.
There you go. And I can't believe how much you girls partied as young. You spoke about going off the rails as teenagers and partying.
Oh, yes.
So you wouldn't know it, would you?
We've had our fair share of parties, yes, but not anymore.
That's right. I think you said now that you're grannies, self-proclaimed grannies, so your sort of life has come down a bit.
Yeah, a little bit.
Okay.
Definitely.
Thank you. Thank you for your time. Sally Douglas and Imogen Khan. And, of course, Yvonne Madden from Life After. Thanks for joining us in the studio.
Thanks, Pat.
And Louisa Smith. A good chat today. We've covered a lot of ground.
Brilliant ladies, very inspiring. So do yourself a favour.
Yeah.
Get the book, follow the podcast.
Wonderful. So thanks for joining us. Louisa Smith from Griefline. My name is Pat Panetta, and this is Life After Loss for Griefline.
We all experience grief and loss. We don't need to go through it alone. Griefline offers free counselling and support, holding space for you to be heard without judgment or labels. We listen, connect, and empower. Our telephone counsellors are available 365 days a year, so there's always someone to talk to. Our supportive online community helps you share and connect to people with similar experiences. And our website gives you access to digital resources, wellbeing practices, and coping strategies. It's never too early or late to seek support. we're here to help you heal and find a way forward together.
You don't have to face your grief alone. Call Griefline 1300 845 745 or visit griefline.org.au.